The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a courier whose reluctance to approach my front door should have served as the first warning. The envelope bore the embossed seal of Harwick Associates, Solicitors, a firm I had never heard of, representing an estate I had never expected to inherit. Great-Aunt Cordelia Dunsleigh had been little more than a whispered name at family gatherings, a reclusive figure whose very existence seemed to embarrass my parents. When pressed for details during my childhood, they would exchange those meaningful glances that adults share when they believe children cannot decode their silent communications. Cordelia keeps to herself, my mother would say, her voice carrying an inflection that suggested this was not entirely by choice. She has her responsibilities. The will was surprisingly straightforward for a document that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life. Cordelia had died alone in the manor that had housed Dunsleigh family members for over 2 centuries, discovered 3 days after her passing by Mrs. Pemberton, the village librarian who had maintained the peculiar tradition of delivering groceries to the estate's kitchen door every Thursday. The cause of death was listed as natural, heart failure at the age of 87, but the timing felt deliberate, as if Cordelia had chosen her moment with the same careful consideration she had apparently applied to every other aspect of her solitary existence. Mr. Harwick himself contacted me within the week, his voice carrying the weight of professional obligation tinged with something approaching relief. "Miss Dunsleigh has left very specific instructions," he explained during our telephone conversation. "The property transfers to you in its entirety, along with a modest endowment for maintenance and upkeep. There is, however, one condition that must be understood and honored." The condition was both simple and inexplicably unsettling. All rooms of Dunsleigh Manor could be explored, renovated, and inhabited as I saw fit, with one absolute exception. The attic was to remain sealed indefinitely. The keys to the attic door were not included in the transfer of property, and any attempt to gain access would void the inheritance entirely, reverting ownership to a trust administered by the town of Millbrook Hollow. "I trust this arrangement is acceptable," Mr. Harwick had said, though his tone suggested that my acceptance was less a question than a foregone conclusion. "The condition has been honored by every Dunsleigh guardian for the past century and 3/4. I see no reason why that tradition should be broken now." Guardian. The word lingered in my mind as I made the 6-hour drive to Millbrook Hollow 3 weeks later. Not owner, not heir, not even resident. Guardian implied responsibility, vigilance, protection. Guardian suggested that something required watching. Dunsleigh Manor rose from the autumn landscape like a monument to architectural ambition tempered by New England pragmatism. Built in 1823 by Ezra Dunsleigh, a merchant whose prosperity had survived both the War of 1812 and the subsequent economic uncertainties, the house commanded a modest hill overlooking the village below. Georgian symmetry dominated the facade, with 12 tall windows arranged in perfect balance across 3 stories, each pane reflecting the afternoon light like watchful eyes. The grounds had not been maintained with the same attention as the house itself. What had once been formal gardens now surrendered to a more natural arrangement, with overgrown hedgerows creating intimate spaces that felt both inviting and concealing. Ancient oak trees formed a protective canopy over much of the property, their branches so thick and interwoven that even in October, with half their leaves already carpeting the ground, they created pockets of premature twilight. My first night in the manor was spent in what had clearly been Cordelia's preferred sitting room, a modest space on the ground floor furnished with pieces that spoke of comfort rather than display. A fire crackled in the hearth. The wood had been laid and kindling prepared, as if my arrival had been anticipated. The room held the accumulated scent of decades, old wood polish, aged fabric, and something else, something faintly sweet and indefinably organic that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was here, surrounded by Cordelia's carefully preserved possessions, that I began to understand the weight of what I had inherited. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, formal portraits spanning generations, each showing a Dunsleigh family member standing before the manor's facade. But these were not the traditional family groupings one might expect. Each photograph contained only a single subject, a solitary figure, always the same age, always bearing the same expression of watchful resignation. The house settled around me as evening deepened, its timbers creaking with the satisfied sighs of a structure that has learned to accommodate the rhythms of weather and time. But beneath these familiar sounds, I began to detect something else, a subtle percussion that seemed to emanate from somewhere above, footsteps perhaps, or the sound of furniture being moved across wooden floors. The attic, I realize. The sealed attic where no one had walked for decades. I told myself it was settling, thermal expansion and contraction, the natural sounds of an old house adjusting to changing temperatures. But as I lay in Cordelia's bed that first night, listening to the manor's nocturnal symphony, I could not escape the impression that I was not alone, that somewhere above me, in the space I was forbidden to enter, something was very much awake. Cordelia's study occupied the northeast corner of the manor's second floor, its windows offering views of both the village below and the darker expanse of forest that stretched toward the mountains. Unlike the sitting room's comfortable informality, this space reflected a mind devoted to meticulous record-keeping and careful observation. Oak filing cabinets lined two walls, their contents organized with the precision of a professional archivist. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its leather surface scarred by decades of use but still bearing the tools of Cordelia's final work. Fountain pens arranged by color, stacks of correspondence bound with faded ribbon, and a leather-bound ledger, whose pages showed the accumulated weight of regular entries. It was this ledger that first revealed the true nature of what Cordelia had called, in her careful script, the arrangement. The entries began with her own handwriting in 1956, when she had inherited the manor at the age of 21, following the death of her uncle Matthias. But the accounting stretched back much further, transcribed from earlier records in the same methodical style that characterized all of Cordelia's work. Monthly payments to various families in Millbrook Hollow, amounts that had grown over the decades but maintained their essential purpose. For remembrance, for silence, for the boundary maintained. The recipients were always the same surnames: Pemberton, Millbrook, Carey, Blackwood, Thornton, Vance, and Reed, families whose roots in the community stretched back to the village's founding. The amounts were substantial, particularly in the earlier decades when such sums would have represented significant portions of a working family's income. More intriguing were the additional notations that accompanied certain payments. Following the Henderson incident, or after the Carey child's dreams, or, most cryptically, emergency disbursement, boundary weakening noted. Correspondence files revealed the delicate negotiations required to maintain these arrangements across generations. Letters from town officials acknowledged receipt of annual endowments for historical preservation and memorial maintenance, while private communications with individual families spoke in careful euphemisms about honoring our agreement and maintaining the peace that benefits us all. One letter, dated 1982 and bearing the letterhead of Millbrook Hollow's Town Council, was particularly illuminating. Dear Miss Dunsleigh, we write to confirm that the recent disturbances reported by the Blackwood family have ceased following your intervention. The Council wishes to express our continued gratitude for your family's dedication to preserving the delicate balance that has served our community so well. And as discussed, we have reminded all concerned parties of their obligations regarding discretion and the importance of maintaining established boundaries. But it was the photographs that truly began to reveal the human cost of this arrangement. Tucked between the pages of the ledger were dozens of images spanning nearly 2 centuries, beginning with daguerreotypes from the 1840s and progressing through every photographic innovation to Cordelia's own Polaroid snapshots from the 1980s. Each showed a Dunsleigh family member standing in the same location, before the sealed door of the manor's attic. The progression was haunting in its consistency. Ezra Dunsleigh in 1847, his face gaunt with what the daguerreotype's long exposure had captured as permanent exhaustion. His nephew Joseph in 1878, shoulders bent as if carrying invisible weight. Joseph's daughter Margaret in 1903, her eyes holding an expression of profound sorrow. And so it continued, each guardian bearing the same burden, each image documenting not just the passage of time, but the accumulation of something that grew heavier with each generation. The final photograph showed Cordelia herself, taken perhaps 5 years before her death. She stood before the attic door as her ancestors had, but, unlike their resigned acceptance, her expression held something approaching defiance. In her hand, barely visible in the photograph's composition, was a key. My exploration of the study's contents revealed that Cordelia had spent her final years researching ways to break the cycle that had claimed every Dunsleigh guardian since Ezra. Correspondence with paranormal investigators, theologians, and historians filled an entire filing cabinet. Each consultation had reached the same conclusion. The arrangement could not be simply abandoned. Too much had been invested, too many lives affected, too many consequences set in motion to, simply walk away. But perhaps most disturbing were Cordelia's own journals from the past decade, written in the same careful script, but bearing the weight of increasing desperation. She described attempts to communicate with whatever presence inhabited the attic, offerings of apology and requests for release that were met with responses she never explicitly described, but which clearly terrified her. "They are not satisfied with remembrance," she wrote in one entry. "They want acknowledgement, they want truth, they want justice. But justice, after so many years, may be indistinguishable from revenge." The journals revealed that Cordelia had never married, never left Millbrook Hollow for more than a few days, never pursued the career in teaching that her college degree had prepared her for. Her entire adult life had been dedicated to maintaining the arrangement, to preserving whatever fragile peace existed between the living and the dead, between past sins and present stability. Her final entry, dated just 2 weeks before her death, consisted of a single line: "The boundary weakens. A new guardian must be prepared. God forgive us all." As I closed the ledger and returned it to its place on the desk, the house around me seemed to shift almost imperceptibly, as if my newfound knowledge had altered some fundamental equilibrium. The footsteps above continued their patient rhythm, and for the first time, I could swear I heard something else. The sound of children whispering, their voices too distant to understand but carrying an unmistakable tone of urgency. The arrangement, I was beginning to understand, was not simply about maintaining silence. It was about maintaining a boundary between two worlds, and I had just learned that the responsibility for that boundary now rested with me. November arrived with an early frost that turned the manor's windows into crystalline barriers between the warm teeth within and the growing cold without. The house seemed to respond to the changing season with increased activity, as if the dropping temperatures had awakened something that had dozed through the warmer months. The footsteps above grew more frequent, no longer confined to evening hours but occurring throughout the day with a regularity that suggested purpose rather than random wandering. It was during my 3rd week of residence that I first heard the voices clearly. I had been cataloging Cordelia's extensive library, noting the preponderance of local histories and genealogical records, when the sound of children's laughter drifted down from the ceiling above. Not the joyful laughter of play, but something more complex, a sound that held notes of both delight and sorrow, as if the children were laughing at jokes that no longer brought them pleasure. The voices came most often in the early evening, during that liminal time when day surrenders to night and the manor's interior grew thick with shadows. Sometimes it was laughter, sometimes whispered conversations in words I could almost but never quite distinguish. Occasionally, I could swear I heard my name being called from above, spoken in the high, clear voices of children who somehow knew of my presence. My attempts to investigate the source of these sounds were consistently frustrated by the locked attic door. Located at the end of the 2nd-floor hallway, the door was constructed of heavy oak and bound with iron hardware that spoke of both age and deliberate reinforcement. The lock was unlike anything I had seen in the rest of the manor, a complex mechanism that required not 1 but 3 keys, each of different design and era. Above the doorframe, carved directly into the wood, was a series of symbols that resembled no alphabet I recognized but which seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond my comprehension. The townspeople of Millbrook Hollow proved equally enigmatic when approached about the manor's history. My first visit to the village proper, ostensibly to establish accounts with local merchants and introduce myself as the new resident of Dunsleigh Manor, was met with responses that followed a distinctly uniform pattern. Conversations would begin normally enough, with the polite curiosity appropriate to a small community greeting a newcomer. But the moment I mentioned my residency at the manor, faces would close, voices would become carefully neutral, and topics would shift with practiced ease to safer subjects. Mrs. Pemberton, the elderly librarian who had discovered Cordelia's body, proved slightly more forthcoming during my visit to the Millbrook Hollow Historical Society. A woman in her 70s whose family had served the community in various capacities for over a century, she possessed the kind of institutional memory that makes small-town libraries invaluable repositories of local knowledge. The Dunsleigh family has always been dedicated to historical preservation, she told me, as we stood in the Society's modest archive room, surrounded by carefully maintained records of the village's past. Your Aunt Cordelia was particularly committed to ensuring that certain difficult periods in our community's history were properly remembered and honored. When I pressed for specifics about these difficult periods, Mrs. Pemberton's demeanor shifted subtly. Her hands, which had been confidently navigating the filing systems, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. "There was an incident," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Many years ago. Before my time, of course, but the records tell a story that is not easily forgotten." She directed me to a collection of documents from the winter of 1847, files that she handled with the reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. The official record spoke of a structural collapse at Dunsleigh Manor during an exceptionally harsh winter, resulting in the tragic loss of 7 children who had been housed in the building's upper floors as part of a charitable arrangement with local families facing economic hardship. But even these sanitized official accounts raised troubling questions. Why were the children housed in the attic rather than more appropriate quarters? Why were there no surviving witnesses to the alleged structural collapse? And most significantly, why were the bodies never recovered, despite extensive searches of the manor's grounds and the surrounding forest? Mrs. Pemberton's voice grew even quieter as she spoke of the aftermath. The families were compensated, of course. The Dunsleigh family has always taken care of those affected by the tragedy. It's an arrangement that has served everyone well for many generations. She paused, her eyes focusing on something beyond the archive room's small window. But some losses can never truly be compensated, can they? Some wounds never properly heal. As autumn deepened into early winter, the manor's behavior intensified. The voices from above grew more distinct, resolving into individual speakers whose personalities began to emerge through repetition and inflection. There was Sarah, whose voice carried the authority of an older child trying to maintain order among her companions. Timothy, who spoke in the careful tones of a boy trying to sound braver than he felt. Little Mary, whose whispered questions about going home broke my heart with their innocent persistence. But it was the architectural anomalies that truly began to disturb my sense of reality. The manor's exterior, viewed from the grounds, suggested an attic space of modest proportions, perhaps large enough for storage and little else. Yet the sounds from above indicated a much larger area, with footsteps that seemed to traverse distances impossible within the building's apparent dimensions. When I measured the second-floor hallway and compared it to the manor's external wall spacing, I discovered a discrepancy of nearly 15 feet. Somewhere above me was space that shouldn't exist, room that the building's facade couldn't account for. The original architectural plans discovered in Cordelia's study only deepened the mystery. Ezra Dunsleigh's 1823 construction documents showed an attic designed as servants' quarters, with multiple small rooms and a central common area. But renovations documented in 1848, just months after the structural collapse, had reconfigured the entire space into something the plans described only as specialized storage. As December approached and the first significant snowfall began to dust the manor's grounds, I found myself spending increasing amounts of time standing in the second-floor hallway, listening to the voices above and wondering what Cordelia had meant when she wrote about maintaining the boundary. The children's voices carried an increasing urgency, as if the changing season was affecting them as much as it was the world below. One evening, as I stood before the sealed door listening to what sounded like a heated discussion among the voices above, I thought I heard something new, an adult voice, older and filled with authority, speaking in tones that suggested both command and desperation. The voice was too distant and distorted to understand, but its presence among the children's voices suggested that whatever inhabited the attic was not as simple as the spirits of 7 lost children. The boundary that Cordelia had spent her life maintaining was not just between the living and the dead, but between past and present, between truth and the comfortable lies that communities tell themselves to survive their darkest chapters. And as winter settled over Millbrook Hollow with an intensity that seemed to mirror the harshness of that long-ago winter of 1847, I began to understand that maintaining that boundary might require more than I was prepared to give. The Millbrook County Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of the village, its resources far exceeding what one might expect for a community of fewer than 3,000 residents. This abundance, I discovered, was largely due to consistent donations from the Dunsleigh Family Trust, contributions that had been maintained without interruption for over a century, and which came with the subtle understanding that certain materials would be preserved but not prominently displayed. Mrs. Pemberton had reluctantly provided me with access to what she termed the restricted collection, documents that were technically part of the public record but which required special permission to examine. These materials were housed in a climate-controlled basement archive, filing cabinets lined with folders whose contents had been organized not by historical significance, but by what appeared to be degrees of potential controversy. The folder labeled Millbrook Incident, 1847, was notably thick, filled with documents that painted a picture far more complex and disturbing than the official version I had initially encountered. The children who disappeared during that harsh winter were not random victims of economic circumstance, but had been specifically selected from families facing the most desperate conditions. More troubling still, I had not simply been housed at the manor temporarily, but had been living there for nearly 2 months before their disappearance. Contemporary newspaper accounts, preserved despite their obvious reluctance to delve too deeply into the details, described the children as having been placed under the care and protection of the Dunsleigh household during the harsh winter season as an act of Christian charity. But witness statements buried deep in the legal files told a more complex story. Martha Thornton, whose 7-year-old daughter Elizabeth was among the missing children, had provided testimony to the county sheriff that was remarkable for both its detail and its subsequent disappearance from official proceedings. According to Martha's statement, the children had not been living in normal household conditions, but had been confined to the manor's attic for reasons she was never able to determine. When she attempted to visit Elizabeth, she was told by Ezra Dunsleigh that the children were engaged in special studies that required isolation and complete concentration. More disturbing were her descriptions of the children's condition during her few permitted visits. Elizabeth seemed changed, Martha had written in careful script. She spoke little, and when she did speak, it was of lessons and preparations that made no sense to me. She asked strange questions about our family, about deaths and births, about things that happened before she was born. When I asked who was teaching her such things, she would only say that the master knew what was necessary. Thomas Millbrook, patriarch of the family for whom the village was named, had provided even more specific details about the nature of the lessons the children were receiving. His son David, age 9, had managed to get word to his family about midnight gatherings in which the children were required to recite names and dates, to repeat stories of deaths and tragedies, and to participate in what David described as remembering for those who can, and remember themselves. But it was the testimony of Reverend Jonathan Carey, whose daughter Anne was the oldest of the missing children at 12 years old, that provided the most chilling insights into what had transpired during those final weeks. Carey had attempted to remove his daughter from the manor after she had confided to him about the special ceremonies that occurred during the darkest hours of the night. According to Anne, the children were taught that they had been chosen for a sacred purpose, to serve as vessels for memories that would otherwise be lost, to carry the voices of those who had died without proper acknowledgement or burial. Ezra Dunsleigh had refused to allow Anne's removal, citing a contract that Carey himself had signed agreeing to the arrangement. When Carey threatened legal action, he was reminded of debts his family owed to Dunsleigh business interests, debts that could be called in immediately if the arrangement was disrupted. Carey's testimony included his growing realization that the children had not been rescued from desperate circumstances, but had been deliberately collected for purposes that became more terrifying as winter deepened. The final entries in the restricted files concerned the aftermath of the children's disappearance. The official investigation, led by Sheriff Marcus Reed, had concluded after 3 days that a structural collapse had buried the children beneath debris that would be too dangerous to excavate until spring. When spring arrived, no excavation was undertaken. Instead, the area was declared a memorial space, and the Dunsleigh family established a trust to maintain it in perpetuity. But private correspondence between Sheriff Reed and county officials revealed the true nature of what had occurred. Reed's confidential report, marked "Not for Public Record," described evidence of ritualistic activity in the manor's attic, circles carved into wooden floors, symbols painted on walls with what appeared to be blood, and an altar constructed from local stone. Most disturbing was his description of finding the children's clothing arranged in careful patterns that suggested not hasty flight, but deliberate preparation for some kind of ceremony. Reed's investigation had uncovered Ezra Dunsleigh's involvement with what the sheriff carefully termed irregular religious practices that had been imported from European occult traditions. These practices, according to Reed's research, involved the use of child mediums to communicate with and appease the spirits of those who had died violently or unjustly. The theory that emerged from Reed's investigation was that Dunsleigh had been attempting to address some previous wrongdoing, some earlier death or injustice, by offering the 7 children as permanent intermediaries between the world of the living and whatever restless dead required satisfaction. The investigation's conclusion was both pragmatic and horrifying. The children had not died in an accident, but had been transformed into something else entirely. Their young lives sacrificed to maintain a spiritual barrier between past sins and present consequences. Sheriff Reed's final report recommended that the truth never be revealed publicly, as it would destroy not only the Dunsleigh family, but the entire community that had allowed the situation to develop. Instead, the arrangement was formalized. The Dunsleigh family would maintain the barrier that the children's sacrifice had created, ensuring that whatever restless spirits had been appeased would remain satisfied. And the community would benefit from this protection while maintaining the silence that made it possible. The families who had lost their children would be compensated for their loss and their discretion, and the children themselves would continue their service, trapped between life and death, carrying memories and voices that could never be allowed to rest. As I read these documents in the Historical Society's basement archive surrounded by the accumulated secrets of nearly 2 centuries, I began to understand the true weight of what Cordelia had called her burden. The footsteps above the manor's ceiling were not the wandering of lost spirits, but the continued service of 7 children who had been condemned to an eternal duty. The voices I heard were not pleas for release, but the ongoing work they had been assigned, maintaining the boundary between worlds, carrying the memories of the dead, and ensuring that past sins remained buried beneath layers of community complicity and enforced silence. The arrangement had never been about charity or accident. It had been about power, control, and the terrible mathematics of community survival. 7 children had been sacrificed so that an entire village could live with the consequences of whatever sins had preceded their deaths. And every Dunsleigh guardian since Ezra had maintained that sacrifice, adding their own burden to the children's eternal service. As I prepared to leave the Historical Society that December evening, Mrs. Pemberton approached me with an expression of profound sadness. "Now you know," she said simply. "Now you understand why some knowledge is better left buried, why some truths are too heavy for any one person to carry alone." She paused, her elderly hands clutching a folder I had not seen before. "But there is more. There is always more. And if you truly intend to be the manor's guardian, you must know everything, including what your family has been protecting us from all these years." The folder she handed me bore a single word written in faded ink. Before. The folder labeled Before contained documents that predated the Millbrook incident by nearly a decade, revealing that the 7 children's sacrifice had not been Ezra Dunsleigh's initial sin, but his desperate attempt at redemption. The truth was far more complex and horrifying than the community's carefully maintained narrative had suggested. In 1838, Ezra Dunsleigh had partnered with 5 other prominent men in establishing what they called the Millbrook Development Corporation. Their goal was ambitious: to transform the sleepy farming community into a thriving industrial center by constructing a textile mill powered by the rushing waters of Millbrook Creek. The project required significant investment, both financial and human, and the partners had been willing to cut corners that more established industrialists might have avoided. The mill's construction had relied heavily on immigrant workers, Irish families fleeing poverty and persecution, drawn by promises of steady employment and fair wages that proved to be significantly exaggerated. These workers lived in company housing that barely met the standards for human habitation, worked shifts that extended well beyond reasonable limits, and found themselves trapped by debts to the company store that grew faster than their wages could address them. The industrial accident that occurred on November 15, 1838, was both predictable and preventable. Inadequate safety measures, poorly maintained equipment, and the pressure to maintain production quotas had created conditions that made disaster inevitable. When the mill's main support beam finally gave way, it brought down not just machinery and structural elements, but the hopes and futures of 23 workers who were buried beneath the collapse. But it was the response to the accident that transformed a tragic industrial failure into something far more sinister. Rather than accepting responsibility and providing proper compensation to the victims' families, the Millbrook Development Corporation chose to obscure the truth. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves on Dunsleigh property. Official records were altered to show that the workers had left town seeking employment elsewhere. Families who demanded answers were met with threats, financial pressure, and, in several cases, mysterious disappearances of their own. The cover-up was comprehensive and brutal. Sheriff Marcus Reed's predecessor, Sheriff William Blackwood, had been paid to ensure that no official investigation proceeded beyond the most superficial inquiry. The local newspaper, owned by one of the Development Corporation's partners, reported the incident as a minor equipment failure that had resulted in temporary closure for repairs. Church records were altered to remove evidence of funeral services for the victims. For 9 years, this deception held. The mill was rebuilt, operated profitably, and the community prospered while the 23 victims lay in unmarked graves, their families either silenced by fear or driven from the region entirely. Ezra Dunsleigh, as the corporation's primary partner, had profited most from both the mill's success and the cost savings achieved through their callous disregard for worker safety. But secrets, especially secrets involving violent death and deliberate injustice, have a way of demanding acknowledgement. Beginning in 1846, nearly a decade after the accident, Millbrook Hollow began experiencing what contemporary accounts carefully described as unusual disturbances. Tools and equipment would be found moved or damaged. Livestock would be discovered dead without apparent cause. Crops would fail in specific patterns that seemed to spell out words or symbols. More troubling were the reports of sightings. Figures glimpsed at dawn or dusk that resembled the missing workers, faces that appeared in windows of empty buildings, voices speaking in Irish accents that called out names of family members who had long since moved away or died. These manifestations focused particularly on the homes and businesses of the 6 Development Corporation partners, with Ezra Dunsleigh experiencing the most intense activity. Dunsleigh's private journals from this period, preserved in the restricted collection, revealed a man approaching psychological collapse under the weight of supernatural harassment. He wrote of sleepless nights spent listening to voices calling his name, of finding his study rearranged each morning despite locking the doors, of discovering symbols carved into the walls of his home that matched those he had seen at the mill accident site. But most disturbing were his accounts of the dreams that began to plague him, vivid, detailed visions of the mill collapse that showed him not the official version of events, but the true horror of what had occurred. In these dreams, he relived the moments of impact from the perspective of each victim, experiencing their terror, their pain, and their final understanding that their deaths were the result of deliberate negligence rather than unavoidable accident. The dreams also carried messages. The 23 victims, speaking through Dunsleigh's unconscious mind, demanded not revenge but acknowledgement. They wanted their names recorded, their families notified, their graves properly marked. They wanted the truth about their deaths to be revealed and the responsibility for those deaths to be accepted. Most significantly, they wanted assurance that their sacrifice would not be forgotten, that future workers would be protected from the kind of exploitation that had cost them their lives. Dunsleigh's initial attempts to address these demands through conventional means, proper burial, financial compensation to surviving family members, improved safety standards at the mill, proved insufficient. The manifestations continued, growing more intense and affecting not just Dunsleigh, but the entire community. It was during the particularly harsh winter of 1847 that the situation reached its crisis point. The 23 victims, somehow given power by the community's collective guilt and fear, had begun to affect the living in more direct ways. Unexplained illnesses swept through Millbrook Hollow. Accidents occurred with supernatural frequency. Children began speaking in voices not their own, recounting memories of lives they had never lived and describing experiences that belonged to the mill workers who had died nearly a decade earlier. It was then that Ezra Dunsleigh, consulting with practitioners of what he called the old knowledge, conceived of the arrangement that would define his family's legacy for the next century and 3/4. The 23 victims required vessels through which they could maintain their presence in the world of the living. They needed intermediaries who could carry their memories, speak their truths, and ensure that their deaths were never completely forgotten. 7 children, selected for their sensitivity to spiritual influences and their families' desperate circumstances, would be transformed into permanent bridges between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Through ritual and sacrifice, they would become living repositories for the memories and voices of the 23 mill workers, ensuring that the workers' demands for acknowledgement would be satisfied while containing their influence within carefully controlled boundaries. The arrangement was, in its own horrific way, a success. The supernatural disturbances that had plagued Millbrook Hollow ceased immediately following the children's transformation. The community prospered as the mill continued to operate profitably. The 23 victims found the acknowledgement they had demanded, their memories preserved and their voices heard through the 7 children who now served as their eternal representatives. But the cost was beyond calculation. 7 innocent children had been condemned to an existence between life and death, their childhood sacrificed to maintain a barrier between past sins and present prosperity. They had become the community's living memory, carrying not only their own experiences but the accumulated pain and injustice of 23 workers whose deaths had been deliberately obscured. As I sat in Mrs. Pemberton's archive room, surrounded by the documented evidence of my family's central role in this centuries-old horror, I began to understand why Cordelia had spent her final years researching ways to break the cycle. The arrangement had preserved the community's stability and prosperity for nearly 200 years, but it had done so at the cost of 7 children's freedom and 23 workers' justice. The voices I heard in the manor's attic were not simply the spirits of lost children, but the active agents of a supernatural compromise that had transformed personal guilt into community responsibility. Every Dunsleigh guardian had maintained this arrangement, adding their own life force to the barrier that kept the past contained while ensuring that the present could continue unburdened by the full weight of historical truth. Mrs. Pemberton's voice was barely audible as she spoke her final revelation. Your Aunt Cordelia believed she had found a way to release them all, the children, the workers, everyone trapped by what happened so long ago. But she also believed that releasing them might mean releasing everything they've been holding back for nearly 2 centuries. All the guilt, all the consequences, all the justice that's been deferred for so long. As I prepared to return to the manor that December evening, carrying with me the full knowledge of what my inheritance truly meant, I understood that I faced the same impossible choice that had confronted every Dunsleigh guardian since Ezra: maintain the arrangement and preserve the community's stability while condemning 7 children to continued servitude, or attempt to break the cycle and risk unleashing nearly 2 centuries of suppressed consequences upon everyone who had benefited from their sacrifice. The boundary that Cordelia had spent her life maintaining was not just between worlds but between justice and peace, between truth and survival, between the demands of the past and the needs of the present. And as winter deepened over Millbrook Hollow with a severity that seemed to echo that terrible winter of 1847, I realized that the choice was no longer theoretical but immediate and unavoidable. December brought with it a cold more penetrating than anything the region had experienced in decades. Weather reports spoke of atmospheric anomalies, unusual pressure systems, and the kind of sustained Arctic conditions that occurred perhaps once in a generation. But for those who understood the true history of Millbrook Hollow, the timing felt less coincidental than inevitable. The manor responded to the deepening cold with increased activity that followed patterns I was beginning to recognize. The children's voices grew more distinct as temperatures dropped, their conversations becoming detailed enough that I could distinguish individual personalities and concerns. Sarah, who seemed to serve as their leader, spoke often of preparing for the remembering time. Timothy worried about whether they had learned all the names properly. Little Mary asked repeatedly when they would be allowed to go see the sleeping ones and whether their families remembered them. But it was the adult voice, the one I had begun to hear with increasing frequency as winter deepened, that truly disturbed my understanding of the arrangement. This voice carried the weight of command and desperation that I had come to associate with Ezra Dunsleigh himself, speaking in tones that suggested both authority and profound regret. Through careful listening over many nights, I began to piece together fragments of his ongoing presence among the children he had condemned to eternal service. "The boundary grows thin," I heard him say one particularly bitter evening, his words drifting down through the ceiling with crystalline clarity. "The cold calls them, just as it did before. We must be ready. The children must be ready. The names must be spoken, the memories maintained, the dead acknowledged, always acknowledged." Cordelia's journals from her final months took on new meaning as I reread them in light of my growing understanding. Her research into methods of spiritual release had focused particularly on the winter months, when the supernatural activity reached its peak intensity. She had documented temperature readings that showed the manor's attic maintaining conditions far colder than the surrounding structure, as if the space existed in a perpetual winter that mirrored the harsh season of 1847. More disturbing were her notes about the physical changes she had observed in herself during extended exposure to the children's presence. Photographs from her final years showed a woman who appeared decades older than her chronological age, her hair white and her face bearing the deep lines of someone who had carried burdens far beyond normal human experience. Her handwriting, once precise and confident, had become increasingly erratic, with words that seemed to shift between her own voice and others that spoke through her. Her final attempts to communicate directly with the children had been documented in detail, revealing conversations that transcended normal human interaction. Through a combination of spoken questions and written responses that appeared without explanation on paper left beneath the attic door, Cordelia had conducted interviews with each of the 7 children over the course of several months. Sarah, at age 11 when she was transformed, retained the clearest memory of her original life. She spoke of parents who worked the land, of younger siblings she had helped raise, of dreams of someday becoming a teacher like the woman who visited from the county seat twice each month. But she also spoke of her current existence with a matter-of-factness that was heartbreaking in its acceptance. "We hold the voices now," she had written in response to Cordelia's questions. "The men who died tell us their stories, and we remember so they won't be lost. It's important work, even if it makes us sad sometimes." Timothy, age 9, served as what he called the counter, maintaining an exact accounting of the 23 mill workers and ensuring that each of their stories was preserved without alteration. His responses to Cordelia revealed an encyclopedic knowledge of industrial accidents, worker safety practices, and the legal standards that had been violated in the mill's construction. This knowledge, far beyond what any 9-year-old could have possessed naturally, came directly from the workers whose memories he now carried. Little Mary, the youngest at age 6, had perhaps suffered the most from the transformation. Her responses were often fragmented, switching between her own voice and those of the workers without warning. "I want to go home," she would write, only to have the handwriting change mid-sentence to continue. "But the machines are still dangerous and someone must remember to make them safe." But it was the conversations with David Millbrook, age 10, that revealed the true horror of the children's situation. David had retained the strongest connection to his original family, and through him, Cordelia learned that the children were fully aware of the passage of time, of the decades that had slipped by while they remained trapped between childhood and death. They knew that their parents had died, that their siblings had grown old and passed away, that generations of their descendants lived in the village below, unaware of the 7 children who maintained the supernatural barrier that protected their community. "We see them sometimes," David had written, "our family's children and their children's children. They look like us, but they get to grow up. They get to leave this place. They get to forget. When Cordelia asked if he resented this difference, his response was devastating in its mature understanding. Resentment is for the living. We are something else now. We have work to do. The adult voice that increasingly dominated the attic conversations belonged unmistakably to Ezra Dunsleigh himself. Through Cordelia's notes, I learned that he had not simply orchestrated the children's transformation, but had bound his own spirit to theirs, ensuring that he would remain to guide and control their eternal service. His presence served multiple purposes. He provided the authority needed to maintain discipline among the child spirits. He carried the specific knowledge required to maintain the supernatural barrier, and most significantly, he bore the primary burden of guilt that kept the arrangement stable. Ezra's communications with Cordelia revealed a man who had spent nearly 2 centuries in a state of conscious penance, fully aware of the magnitude of his crimes but trapped by the very solution he had created to address them. "I cannot rest while they serve," he had written. "I cannot be forgiven while they remain unforgiven. I cannot find peace while peace requires their sacrifice." But Ezra also served as a warning about the consequences of breaking the arrangement. Through him, Cordelia learned that the supernatural barrier maintained by the 7 children held back far more than the restless spirits of 23 mill workers. Over the decades, other injustices had occurred in Millbrook Hollow. Deaths that were covered up, crimes that were ignored, sins that were forgotten by the living but remembered by the dead. All of these accumulated grievances had been absorbed into the arrangement, contained by the children's service, but never resolved. "Release them," Ezra had warned Cordelia, "and you release everything, every covered-up death, every ignored crime, every sin that this community has chosen to forget rather than address. The children hold not just the 23 workers, but all the darkness that has accumulated since. They are the barrier between justice and survival, between truth and prosperity, between what was done and what must be paid." Cordelia's final months had been spent researching alternatives to the arrangement, seeking ways to address the accumulated injustices without destroying the community that had benefited from their concealment. She had consulted with historians, theologians, and practitioners of various spiritual traditions, but each had reached the same conclusion. Debts of this magnitude, accumulated over such a long period, could not be simply forgiven or forgotten. They required either continued containment or full payment, and full payment would likely destroy not just the guilty but the innocent descendants who had inherited the benefits of ancestral crimes. Her death, I was beginning to understand, had not been simply the result of old age and failing health. Cordelia had died of exhaustion, the accumulated weight of maintaining spiritual barriers that required constant attention and personal sacrifice. Each Dunsleigh guardian had aged prematurely under this burden, their life force gradually consumed by the effort required to maintain the arrangement that kept the past contained. As I spent my own December nights listening to the voices above, feeling the house grow colder despite the furnace's constant operation, I began to experience the first signs of the transformation that had claimed every guardian before me. My sleep became fragmented, filled with dreams that were not my own, memories of industrial accidents, images of unmarked graves, conversations in languages I had never learned but somehow understood. More disturbing was my growing ability to hear not just the children's voices, but the workers they represented. During the deepest hours of winter nights, the attic filled with the sounds of 23 men and women sharing their stories, recounting their deaths, and demanding acknowledgement that could never be publicly given. Their voices carried accents from Cork and Dublin, spoke of families left behind in Ireland, and described working conditions that violated every standard of human decency. Through these involuntary communications, I learned the names that had been systematically erased from official records. Patrick O'Sullivan, the mill's unofficial safety inspector, who had warned repeatedly about structural weaknesses. Margaret Flanagan, a young mother who worked double shifts to support her children while her husband recovered from a previous industrial accident. Thomas McKenna, barely 16, who had been working in the mill for 3 years to pay off his family's passage debt. Each name came with a story, each story with specific details that could be verified against surviving records, each verification adding weight to the growing understanding that I was not simply inheriting property, but becoming the latest link in a chain of spiritual responsibility that stretched back nearly 2 centuries. As December progressed toward the anniversary of the children's transformation, the supernatural activity reached levels that made normal life increasingly impossible. The temperature in the manor dropped so severely that water froze in the pipes despite continuous heating. Electronics malfunctioned in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random. Most significantly, I began to see the children themselves, not as apparitions or glimpses, but as solid present figures who moved through the house with the easy familiarity of long-time residents. They appeared first as shadows at the edges of vision, then as more substantial presences that seemed to occupy the same physical space as the manor's normal reality. Sarah, tall for her 11 years and bearing the serious expression of someone forced to assume adult responsibilities too early. Timothy, whose intense concentration suggested constant mental calculation. Little Mary, clutched a doll that had been buried with her but somehow remained present in whatever existence she now inhabited. But it was David Millbrook who spoke to me directly for the first time, appearing in Cordelia's study on the night of December 20th as I reviewed her final journal entries. He stood beside the desk with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting, his appearance exactly as it would have been in 1847, but carrying an expression that held nearly 2 centuries of accumulated experience. "You understand now," he said, his voice carrying the clear tones of childhood overlaid with wisdom that no child should possess. "You know what we hold, what we carry, what we keep contained so that others can live in peace. The question now is whether you're strong enough to carry it with us, or whether you'll try to release us and risk releasing everything else." His presence was neither threatening nor comforting, but simply factual, a statement of the choice that awaited me as the anniversary of their transformation approached. In 5 days, on December 25th, 1847, 7 children had sacrificed their freedom to contain the consequences of adult crimes. Every year since, on that same date, the arrangement required renewal, recommitment, and the conscious choice to maintain the barrier between justice and survival. The choice that had destroyed Cordelia's peace, consumed her life, and ultimately led to her death, now awaited me. And as David's figure faded back into the winter shadows, I understood that the next 5 days would determine not just my own fate, but the future of everyone who had benefited from the arrangement that had kept Millbrook Hollow's darkest secrets safely buried for nearly 2 centuries. Christmas Eve arrived with a blizzard that seemed to target Millbrook Hollow with supernatural precision. While surrounding communities reported manageable snowfall, our village disappeared beneath drifts that reached second-story windows and winds that howled with voice, as that spoke in languages both familiar and foreign. The storm's timing was no coincidence. It was the same date, December 24th, when the harsh winter of 1847 had reached its peak intensity, trapping the 7 children in circumstances that would seal their fate forever. The manor's response to the approaching anniversary was immediate and overwhelming. Every supernatural manifestation I had experienced over the past months intensified tenfold. The children's voices became constant rather than occasional, their conversations now audible throughout the house rather than confined to areas near the attic. The temperature dropped so severely that my breath became visible even inside rooms where fires burned continuously. But most significantly, the boundary between past and present began to dissolve. Walking through the manor's hallways, I would glimpse scenes from 1847, Ezra Dunsleigh conducting his terrible negotiations with desperate parents, the 7 children huddled together in the attic's cold expanse, the moment of transformation when innocent lives were sacrificed to supernatural necessity. These visions were not memories or dreams, but active presences, as if the approaching anniversary had weakened the barriers between different temporal realities. On the morning of December 24th, I found a letter on Cordelia's desk, written in handwriting I did not recognize, a careful, formal script that belonged to no living person. The message was brief, but carried the weight of ultimate authority. The arrangement requires renewal. The boundary weakens with each passing year, and without conscious recommitment, what we have contained will break free entirely. You have learned the truth. You understand the cost. You know the consequences of both action and inaction. Choose wisely, for your choice affects not just yourself, but all who depend on the barrier we maintain. The children await your decision. so do the 23 who speak through them, so do all the others whose voices have been added to our chorus over the years. Choose quickly, for at midnight, the arrangement either continues or ends forever. The letter was signed not with a name, but with 7 small handprints pressed in what appeared to be ash, the signatures of children who had learned to write their names in substances other than ink. My research into similar cases worldwide, conducted frantically during those final hours, had revealed that such supernatural arrangements were more common than most people realized. Libraries contained carefully buried accounts of families bound by ancestral sins, communities held together by spiritual compromises, and individuals who had inherited responsibilities that stretched far beyond normal human experience. In each case, the fundamental choice remained the same: maintain the arrangement and accept the personal cost, or break the cycle and accept whatever consequences followed. The scholarly consensus was disturbing in its consistency. Arrangements of this magnitude, maintained for such extended periods, could not be simply dissolved without consequences. The spiritual energy contained by years or decades of enforced peace would be released all at once, often with effects that devastated not just the guilty, but entire communities. Justice delayed, the research suggested, became justice amplified, and amplified justice rarely distinguished between those who deserved punishment and those who simply happened to be present when the accounts came due. But the alternative, conscious participation in the continued imprisonment of 7 children, was equally impossible to accept. These were not abstract ethical considerations, but real children whose voices I heard daily, whose personalities I had come to know, whose sacrifice had been prolonged far beyond any reasonable measure of necessary penance. Sarah's dreams of becoming a teacher, Timothy's careful attention to mathematical precision, Mary's simple desire to go home. These were not the concerns of supernatural entities, but of children who deserved the childhood that had been stolen from them. As evening approached and the blizzard reached its peak intensity, I found myself standing once again before the sealed attic door. The 3 keys hung from a ribbon around my neck. Cordelia had hidden them in her jewelry box, along with a note explaining that each guardian must make the choice personally, that the responsibility could not be delegated or avoided. The first key was brass, tarnished with age and bearing symbols that seemed to shift in the candlelight. The second was iron, heavy and cold to the touch, inscribed with names I now recognized as belonging to the 23 mill workers. The third was silver, polished smooth by decades of handling, its surface reflecting not my own face, but the faces of children who watched from the other side of whatever barrier the door represented. Through the door, I could hear them preparing for what they called the renewal ceremony, the annual ritual in which they recommitted themselves to their eternal service. Their voices carried a mixture of resignation and hope that broke my heart. They had been waiting for nearly 2 centuries for someone to make a different choice, but they had also learned not to expect release from their bird. Ezra Dunsleigh's voice rose above the children's, speaking words in Latin that I somehow understood, despite never having studied the language. He was reciting the terms of the original arrangement, acknowledging the crimes that had necessitated the supernatural compact, and requesting continued protection for the community that had benefited from the children's sacrifice. But for the first time since I had begun hearing his voice, Ezra's recitation included a new element, a formal acknowledgement of the option for release. "The choice is offered," he intoned, his words carrying the weight of legal pronouncement. "The guardian may choose renewal or resolution. Both paths carry consequence. Both paths require sacrifice. The children have served faithfully. The debt has been acknowledged. Justice has been contained. But justice contained is not justice served. Choose, guardian. Choose wisely. Choose finally." The temperature around me dropped even further as midnight approached, and I realized that the manor itself was holding its breath, waiting for my decision. Every supernatural presence that had accumulated over nearly 2 centuries was focused on this moment, this choice, this final determination of whether the arrangement would continue or end. I understood now why Cordelia had spent her final years researching alternatives. The choice was not between right and wrong, but between different forms of tragedy. Maintain the arrangement, and 7 children remain trapped in eternal service to contain injustices that the living had chosen to ignore rather than address. break the arrangement, and risk unleashing nearly 2 centuries of suppressed consequences upon a community that included many innocent people who had inherited rather than created the conditions that required supernatural intervention. But as I stood before the sealed door, listening to the children prepare for another year of service they had never chosen, I realized that some choices cannot be made on the basis of consequence alone. Some decisions must be made on the basis of what is right rather than what is safe, what is just rather than what is convenient. At 11:58 p.m. on December 24th, with the blizzard reaching its peak intensity and the manor trembling with supernatural energy, I inserted the first key into its lock. The brass mechanism turned with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment as long as the children themselves. The second key required more effort, its iron weight seeming to increase as I turned it. Through the door, I could hear the children's voices rising in what sounded like both fear and anticipation. They understood what my actions meant, and they were as terrified of freedom as they were eager for it. The third key was the most difficult, not because of mechanical resistance, but because of the weight of finality it represented. As I turned the silver key in its lock, I could hear Ezra Dunsleigh's voice rising in a mixture of warning and gratitude. "It is done," he said, his words carrying both relief and terror. "The choice is made. May God have mercy on us all." As the clock in the manor's entrance hall began to chime midnight, I turned the handle of the attic door and stepped across the threshold that had contained nearly 2 centuries of suppressed justice. Behind me, the blizzard suddenly intensified beyond all natural possibility. Ahead of me, in the space that shouldn't have existed within the manor's walls, 7 children waited to discover what freedom might mean after so many years of service. The door swung open, and the arrangement that had defined Millbrook Hollow's hidden history for 175 years finally came to an end. Whatever consequences followed would be faced by the living, without the buffer of childhood sacrifice to soften the impact of historical truth. In the distance, I could hear the first sounds of change beginning, not the supernatural manifestations I had grown accustomed to, but the very different sounds of a community about to confront truths it had spent nearly 2 centuries avoiding. The choice was made, the boundary was broken, and for better or worse, justice could no longer be contained by the sacrifice of innocence. The 7 children stepped forward into the light, and for the first time in 175 years, they were truly free to discover what lay beyond the door that had held them for so long. The official record states that Dunsleigh Manor was destroyed in a fire of unknown origin during the blizzard of December 24th. No human remains were found in the ruins, though local residents reported seeing figures walking away from the flames, an adult man and 7 children, moving together through the storm toward destinations unknown. The town of Millbrook Hollow experienced significant changes in the months that followed, as long-buried truths about its history began to surface in ways that could no longer be contained or ignored. Some say this was justice final. I served. Others call it the price of breaking arrangements that should never have been made. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between what the living choose to remember and what the dead refuse to forget.